This morning I want to talk about Passover. Passover begins Friday evening, this coming Friday, at dusk and continues for 8 days. It is one of Judaism's major holidays, and it's probably the origin of Christianity's Last Supper. Keeping in mind that Jesus was Jewish and that it's referred to repeatedly in the New Testament as by his disciples as rabbi, and that it was at this time of year they'd gone to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, and they have this dinner. Now, over the years, my predecessors here at UUCIL have from time to time organized and led a Seder meal here at the church. And all our ministers have. I've done this too, half dozen occasions. So the Passover story is the myth, and it's the story, there was a little bit of it here, and I noted it before, about how to mark the door so that the angel passing over, and then it leads to this plagues, these 10 plagues, and really quite a bit of mayhem, and finally Moses and his people escape and cross over the river. That's the Passover story. That's the myth of Passover. Seder is the ritual that commemorates it. And myth and ritual always go together, because you can have the story, but how do you remember the story? Well, it's by acting it out. And if you act it out, and then that gives it form. Myth tells the story, ritual acts out the myth. Now, the Passover story goes like this, and most of you probably know it. I mean, it's kind of well known for sure. The Jews lived in slavery in Egypt, and Moses led them out of Egypt through the Red Sea to Israel. That's the story. What actually happened is this. At least I'm going to relate my Old Testament professor Norman Gottwald's story about it, or how he understood it, and I think makes perfect sense. So 3,300 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, Egypt ruled the land of Canaan more or less as a colony. Political turmoil led to a situation in which the slave caste slowly organized themselves over the following 200 years until they ran the show. So you have in the Fertile Crescent, in the area where Israel is today, you have an imperial power, the Egyptians, which stretched all the way from really modern-day Tunisia across into almost modern-day Syria. But they firmly ruled in what's today Israel. And the slave caste were the Jewish people who lived there, and they did all the work. They were the oppressed locals serving the imperial overlords. But over a period of 200 years, as that Egyptian empire began to crumble, the locals slowly organized themselves until essentially they ran the place. And they established a new political kingdom. And what was especially impressive about this was that their state, as it were, was based on a new way of organizing. Prior to that, all states had had a king. But in their case, the king, as it were, was the collective spirit of the people. Yahweh, they called it. And we can call it God, but you weren't even allowed to say that, and it wasn't a thing at all. It was a spirit of the people. And this was a radically democratic way to organize politically at the time. It's a radically democratic way to organize to this day. So you have this situation developing where the Egyptian empire in Canaan that had been running the show were, over the course of a couple hundred years, pushed out. Now, Egypt, as I mentioned in the meditation, Egypt, it turns out, is really more of a frame of mind than a place. Indeed, the word Egypt in Hebrew means the narrow place, which is a perfect description of the culture that was there before the Jews took control of their fate by joining together and daring to live radically as one community bound together. Bound by a shared spirit, Yahweh, spirit of life, and bound together by a covenant. Now, the Old Testament history recounts the evolution of that covenant. It started out as, kind of a family covenant, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and then slowly it became tribal, and over time it became the whole people, the 12 tribes. And they were bound together by stories. The Passover story is associated with Exodus, as I've been saying, but there were many stories, and also bound together by their associated rituals that went with all these stories. As one of my mentors, my first church in Danbury, Connecticut, there was the rabbi in town who'd been there since 1933, Rabbi Jerome Molino, and he for years the Universalist church there had not had a minister, and back in 1933, when Molino came to Danbury, the Universalist minister, Harry Adams Hersey, was the only cleric in town who walked across the street and shook his hand and welcomed him to town and offered to exchange pulpits. And Jerome Molino never forgot that. And in fact, he and Harry Adams Hersey were very close. When Harry Adams Hersey retired, it was Jerome Molino who didn't have a car. It was Molino who drove him to the retirement community where he moved. And many years he was friends with all the subsequent ministers, and many years later when the church fell back to kind of fellowship status for 12 years, Molino did all their rituals. Anybody want to get married, if they wanted, he would do it. And he would say, and they'd offer him money, he'd say, put it in your minister fund. And so when I got there, he said, oh, I'm glad to be done with that. But I realized, whoa, this guy, he's for real. He truly is for real. So he said to me, one of our many meals together, he said, now you Universalist Unitarians, as he always put it, are a lot like us Reformed Jews, but we have rituals, and you guys don't. So Moses is an example of the hero archetype. At the beginning, he survived by magic almost. He escapes detection and grows up in the palace of the Pharaoh. And years later, he's out as a shepherd in the wilderness, and he's spoken to by Yahweh. He says, let my people go. The story of the burning bush and others. Take your shoes off. Okay. Whoa. And he says, let my people go. This spirit, according to the story, says, you have to go lead my people to freedom. The song we sang. And, Moses, if you read the text, he had a speech impediment. He says, no, I can't do this. I can't do this. He said, no, you're the guy. And he said, no, but I'm not the guy. He said, no, you are the guy. So this goes on, and Moses says, okay, if I'm going to do this, who shall I say sent me? You go back to your tribe and you say, well, I've been told that we're going to escape from freedom and I'm to lead you. Yeah, who told you this? Okay. Who shall I say sent me? And he says, I am that I am, the verb to be, really. It's worth noting that in the Western culture, in our Abrahamic traditions, the name of God is the verb to be, to I am. So it's that is where the power lies, in owning your identity as an agent of life. Anyway, so then there's, he goes and talks to Pharaoh and says, hey, let us go. And he's ignored, and there's the 10 plagues. And finally, there's one plague after another, culminating in the firstborn, cattle and humans. And Jim was saying, when our wonderful cellist this morning, when he saw this quote, he got upset with me, and he said, now this is nothing short of genocide, and I can't support it. And it's a story. I don't support it either. But the story is that Moses tells his people, here's how you avoid getting messed up. And after the death affects every household in Egypt, Pharaoh tells Moses and his brother Aaron, okay, get out of here. Get out of town. And they do. And that's the whole of the Passover story. Now, the Exodus story came to be associated with Passover, but the origin of Passover is actually much, much older. Indeed, the name Passover comes from the Hebrew verb pasa, to skip or pass over, so named because of the tradition that the destroyer passed over the houses marked with the blood of the Paschal lamb when so many others were smote. Now, pastoral in origin, etymologists believe that the festival is, as I said, 800, 1,000 years older than the events described in with Moses and the leaving of the Pharaoh, escaping the Pharaoh. And it may actually come from the named for the skipping of lambs that we've all seen, and little baby goats. And we've seen them frisk and bounce and gambol about. And it's a joyful, delightful thing to watch. This is why we name children kids, I think, is because of the way they are so much like little billy goats, And the lambs and the billy goats are the specific animals designated by Hebraic law for sacrifice in connection with the ancient pastoral celebration from, where we're talking 4,000 years ago. The verb to skip has many, many meanings. To pass along with light springing movements, so skip to Maloo. Sometimes to ricochet as a missile passing, which rebounds along the surface, as in skipping stones. Or to pass from one point or thing to another with disregard or omission of what intervenes. Or to leave hastily, to flee. All these meanings are tied up in the Exodus story. Who among us has not, at one point or another in their lives, gambled freely and with great joy? Who hasn't skipped out in the nick of time, or maybe, or regretfully, to the dismay of someone who was counting on you to hang in there? Who hasn't prayed that they would be skipped over for a tongue lashing, for a tough assignment, or for a dangerous tour of duty? Please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. The Exodus story is a story about all these things, but especially about praying to be passed over, of having those prayers answered. Try not to get hung up on the literal dimensions of the myth if you want to understand it. This is true of all mythology. We can't take it literally. It makes no sense, or it's horrible, But what I try to remind our members is, don't take it literally. That's what fundamentalists do, okay? We understand it as metaphor, as poetry, and it's harsh poetry in this case, but it's still poetry. These are all metaphors. Our spiritual forebears were originally slaves. That is, they were unfree. Then they adopted a covenant. And then they started holding themselves accountable to that covenant. And then, what do you know? They started to thrive. They made it through the turbulent, life-threatening waters of the Red Sea, that is, metaphorically. They made it through a period of fear and uncertainty and onto dry ground. It took them a while, 40 years in the wilderness, followed by fits and starts for hundreds of years more, but eventually they learned how to live as a free people. Genesis, Exodus, these are foundational stories, myths of origin. The Passover Exodus myth, in its simplest terms, it seems to me, comes down to this. Our freedom derives from our willingness to bind ourselves together in a covenant. Let me say that again. Our freedom derives from our willingness to bind ourselves in covenant. Free religion, in other words, is not a free-for-all. It's disciplined and demanding. It asks of us everything, as Alain René Bozars echoes when, in another one of the readings, she says, pack nothing, talking about Exodus, talking about the Passover remembered. Pack nothing. Bring only your determination to serve and your willingness to be free. Do not hesitate to leave your old ways behind, fear, silence, submission. Sing songs as you go. Remain true to the mystery. Pass on the story, and do not go back. Over the millennia since the Passover festival first started to evolve, it has continued to change, to embellish, and to transform. As Judaism evolved from a family to a tribal to a national religion and beyond, the prayer that its adherents be passed over when it comes to unbearable heartache, that prayer has been repeated millions of times. And will be again this week and next week and every week for generations to come, the world over. This morning, we gather to affirm the heart of Passover, that liberation is costly because living by a covenant is difficult and demanding. But difficult as living by a covenant may be, living without one inevitably leads to discord and distraction and to loss of vision. Making church thrive is more fun than that. Sometimes it's almost like skipping, lightly prancing about, being festive and playful as baby lambs and kids are. But at other times, sticking with our covenant, being peaceful, truthful, trying to be helpful toward everybody, at times adhering to such a covenant can test a body to their absolute limit. For Unitarian Universalists, covenant is our spiritual practice. It's how liberal, non-orthodox, agnostic-leaning religionists such as ourselves can grow in community and spirit. The concept of covenant has grown over the centuries. What was for Abraham and Sarah a covenant between their family and its daemon grew into a larger and larger circle, encircling over the centuries more and more of humanity. Let us resolve this day to follow our forebears' noble, costly example, to choose freedom, to choose binding ourselves to one another and in covenant with me temporarily as your interim minister, but before long with a new minister, all in hopeful expectation of growing our souls and strengthening our community. To choose, as it is written in the 13th chapter of Deuteronomy, to choose life so that your descendants and this wonderful community may continue to live. So may it be. Amen and shalom. Next week, we take this we take this myth of Exodus and the Passover and see how it's elaborated in the Easter myth, which is kind of so this is kind of an adumbration of the Easter myth now.